Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our small but mighty webinar. My name is Adrian Bordone. I'm going to serve as the moderator today. I'm with GuideStar. We're really thrilled to have some folks from the LEAP ambassadors community on and some team members from a small but mighty organization that's going to help illuminate this great work that small nonprofits are doing, and many of which with the help and support of the LEAP ambassadors community. We have over 1,500 registrants, so I want to give a moment to I'll make sure we're allowing our attendees to join. I do want to remind you that today's webinar will be recorded or is being recorded, and we will make sure to send a copy of that recording to all individuals who register within 48 hours of the conclusion of today's webinar. Next slide. Quick housekeeping note, folks. We have a robust agenda today, a lot of information that I think you're going to find very valuable. While everyone on today's webinar will be muted, we do have the opportunity to take advantage of a GoToWebinar toolset, which exists on your control panel on the right-hand side of your screen to make sure you have an opportunity to ask questions related to today's content. We have a team member of mine named Madeline from GuideStar who is behind the scenes looking out for technical questions. My job will be to make sure I am fielding and responding to and making sure your questions get in front of our presenters today. So please take advantage of the questions tab on the right-hand side of your navigation bar in the GoToMeeting navigation window to submit any questions, and we will do our best to get to those either in the course of the presentation or at the conclusion of today's presentation. Any questions that are asked and are not answered due to time constraints on today's presentation will get responded to. We will have them documented, and we will get back to the person who asked the question in a follow-up correspondence. Next slide. So again, my name is Adrian Bordone. It's a pleasure to welcome you today to our GuideStar webinar in partnership with the LEAP ambassadors community. We're excited to have some Wonder Women, both Debra as a consultant as well as Carol and Sara from SHALVA on today's call to help make sure that you get everything you need to know about some of the motivations behind this important work, some of the challenges and opportunities that present themselves to us as small nonprofit organizations, and what the future might look like if we implement and utilize the performance imperative. Next slide. So in the course of today's presentation and webinar, you're going to learn a little bit about the 7 principles of high performance and how small nonprofits can use these principles to create meaningful and measurable change for the individuals, families, and communities and causes that you serve. We'll specifically dive into the LEAP ambassadors community's performance imperative framework, which you'll learn about today. Debra will take us through that process, and we will most importantly learn how the performance imperative has been used by the team at SHALVA to lean in and drive toward outcomes and results for their target population. Next slide. I want to take a moment to start using a GoToWebinar feature that we really love, which is the polling feature. If you wouldn't mind, please take a moment and tell us through this poll what your role is in the organization that you represent today. Madeline, if you'd activate the poll. We'll give this a moment. Again, please just check one of the options that you see before you. We'll give folks 15 seconds here, and hopefully we can track the results. This will give Debra, Carol, Sara, and me an opportunity to learn a little bit about the perspective you're coming with and maybe anticipate some of the questions and needs you might have on today's webinar. Fantastic. So we see very quickly that the majority of the attendees on today's webinar are either on the executive leadership team or on the staff, which is really instrumental to the acknowledgement of and implementation of the performance imperative as a tool to help lead an organization through its evolution toward measurable results. It's great to see a number of board members. We recognize, Debra and I and other members of the LEAP Ambassadors community recognize the importance of that type of leadership. And nice to see another set of folks represented as other who may have a different perspective. We'd love to hear that represented in the Q&A if there are things that we haven't anticipated from your perspective. Thanks also to our small percentage of funders. It's also great to see, always great to see funders listening in and understanding how small nonprofits are working hard to deliver results in the communities we serve. Next slide. I do have a moment. I just want to take a moment. Madeline has chatted with me and tells me that some folks are struggling to hear the audio. Please chat with Madeline or GuideStar, or pop something in the question tab if you're struggling with that. We'll try to make sure you are getting the audio you need to follow along. Back to our sort of agenda, a quick note on GuideStar. If you're not familiar with GuideStar, we are a free resource. We're a nonprofit tool that helps nonprofit organizations communicate with the donor community. What you see here is a breakdown. We had almost 1,500 registrants for today's webinar. Many of the registrants, the blue bar on the right-hand side, 760 of you, almost half, are not currently taking advantage of GuideStar as a free resource to publicize and amplify your voice in the donor community. You'll understand why that's important in a moment, but I do want to just remind you that while you will learn a tremendous amount today about the LEAP Ambassadors community and the performance imperative, I would encourage you to also recognize the importance of capitalizing on your free GuideStar profile, claiming and updating that profile. When you update your profile, you can earn one of several seals of transparency, and we do see that over 100 folks today have earned the highest GuideStar seal of transparency, which is the Platinum seal. I'll speak about that again in a moment. Next slide. So GuideStar is an aggregator of nonprofit data. Our primary sources of data are nonprofits themselves. As I mentioned a moment ago, you can claim and update your profile. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And of course, the digitization of IRS 990 forms. This provides a tremendous source of data that we then curate and make available to the public through our GuideStar website, next slide, and through our partner channels. So last year, nearly 8 million people gained access to the intelligence they need to guide their giving decisions through GuideStar.org. That's accessible to everyone on today's call. You can look up your own profile after today's webinar and see if it best represents your organization. Increasingly, we are, through the use of some really fantastic technology called APIs, we're able to share the nonprofit data with partners so that they can engage donors in the environments in which they sit. So let's take a look at the next slide and understand what that means. So increasingly, not only are folks coming to GuideStar.org, but many more folks are finding the nonprofit information they're looking for on a variety of platforms, many of which you see here. We're in partnership with Amazon Smile, Facebook, and Google. We also partner with many of the premier donor advised funds. You see Vanguard, Fidelity, Schwab, National Philanthropic Trust. Increasingly, these are a significant source of grants revenue for nonprofit organizations. You also see a number of the grants management software vendors listed here. These are using nonprofit data to auto-populate forms to make it easier for you to fill out the applications and for philanthropic giving. And in the upper left-hand corner, of course, some of our commercial partners, folks who want to know more about the communities that they're trying to serve as businesses or philanthropic entities. Again, the key is really recognizing that you gain access to all of this audience by virtue of claiming and updating your GuideStar profile. I can't say enough. It's a free service. Please consider taking advantage of it. Next slide. You can take advantage of it after today's webinar merely by emailing us at support@guidestar.org. Include your name, your organization's name, and your EIN. Please make sure to use an email address that has the same domain attribution as your web address. So don't use a Yahoo, Hotmail, or Gmail account when emailing us. That will help make sure that we authorize and approve you to claim and update your profile. When you choose to update your profile, you can get to one of 4 levels: bronze, silver, gold, and platinum. Platinum is the level focused on results and has the highest boost in search results for prospective donors, and is really focused on making sure you're sharing the success of your initiatives, many of which and much of which will be discussed by Debra and the SHALVA team today. But you want to get to the highest level possible, recognizing that increasingly donors are looking for nonprofit organizations to demonstrate that they are great stewards of the contributions they're making, that's silver or the financial level, and that they are generating results and driving toward outcomes with these philanthropic investments. Next slide. Quick snapshot of what your organization's finances would look like to a prospective user of GuideStar.org. Next slide. And a note about making sure, again, donors are increasingly looking for evidence of results. You see some of the ways in which some organizations have reflected their results on their GuideStar profile here. And increasingly, diversity, equity, and inclusion data is an important guidestone or touchstone for donors and contributors who are looking to support the organizations they care about. Next slide. And again. So I'm not only a moderator on today's webinar with GuideStar, I'm also proud to be an ambassador with the LEAP Ambassadors community. And while I will step in a moment back into the shadows and monitor Q&A, I do want to mention that I am personally and professionally committed to the work of the LEAP Ambassadors community. I want to share with you what our mission is, which is to inspire, motivate, and convince nonprofit and public sector leaders and their stakeholders to build great organizations for greater societal benefit, and to increase the expectation and adoption of high performance as the path toward this end. I'm really excited about the webinar that we have to offer you today, and want to take this time to hand over the keys to Debra, who's going to take us through the substance of the performance imperative and the great work the LEAP Ambassadors community is doing, and the great work that SHALVA is doing with their tools. Debra?
Great. Thank you so much, Adrian. And before I go ahead and get started, I really want to give a shout out to you and to GuideStar for hosting this webinar. And also a huge thanks to the LEAP Ambassadors Community Support Team for all of their support in getting us ready for today and being able to share this great story. So for those of you on the line, now more than ever, performance matters for all of us, even and perhaps especially for small nonprofits. So in this small but mighty webinar, you'll learn how small nonprofits can deploy 7 principles of high performance to create more meaningful, measurable change. I'll be sharing some general tips as well as a small nonprofit organization in progress. Before we get started, let's take another quick audience poll. We'd love to learn if you are actually a small nonprofit. So if you could look at the poll which just opened, we'd like to know if you represent a small nonprofit defined by the paper and this webinar as being under $3 million in annual revenue. So let us know, who are you on this webinar today? All right, thanks so much. It looks like a huge majority of you, I'm gonna keep it open for another couple seconds here. Looks like a huge majority of folks on the call today are representing small nonprofits, which is great. And for those of you not representing small nonprofits, I think there's something in this to learn for all of us. And we certainly welcome your questions. So we're going to go ahead and close that poll. So thank you for that. Let's dive into what we're going to cover. We really want to look at the definition of high performance. So over time, many people have defined high performance and what it means to strive for it in different ways. The LEAP Ambassadors community has thought about this for a long time, and we're excited to share with you our definition. We're going to also look into what is this thing called the performance imperative, and how can you use it to help boost your own performance at your organization. With that, we'll talk about the specific 7 pillars of high performance. And then we're going to spend the majority of the time talking about how small nonprofits can use the performance imperative to implement steps that move them forward. So a little bit of background here. The Leap of Reason book and then the Ambassadors community really developed the performance imperative after a collaborative year-long process. That culminated in the performance imperative's first public release, which was in February of 2015. And then trying to walk the talk, after receiving and incorporating a great amount of feedback, we released an updated version of the performance imperative in April, so just about a month and a half ago. That version includes refinements that we made based on really listening to and learning from performance imperative users, as well as domain experts. Domain meaning the 7 specific pillars. So the refinements that we made are mostly focused around the importance of constituent feedback, diversity and inclusion, empathy, and advocacy. So let's dive in now to how we defined high performance. Our definition is on your screen, and high performance matters. In this era that we're all living in of seismic social, economic, and political change, the social and public sectors can't afford to expend resources on efforts that are based primarily on good intentions and wishful thinking, rather than rigor and evidence. High performance leads to more meaningful, measurable change, whether it's lifting families out of homelessness, closing health inequities, preserving land, inspiring artistic expression, raising educational achievement, or really any of the myriad missions that give purpose to the world's social sector organizations. There are 7 specific ways that small nonprofits can boost performance. And we call these the 7 pillars of high performance. Although riffing off Stephen Covey's famous book, we like to consider them the 7 habits of highly effective nonprofit organizations. Pillar 1, if you look at your screen, Pillar 1 is really first for a reason. It's the preeminent pillar and the one that often determines whether and how far an organization can travel toward high performance. It's leadership. With that, I want to note a couple of things as you look at these 7 pillars. We recognize that even the most exemplary high-performance organizations don't excel at all times in all 7 pillars equally or simultaneously. In my career in the nonprofit sector, I've worked with hundreds of organizations, and I have to admit that none of them have mastered high performance. So it's not about perfection. It's about a journey toward continuous improvement. The second thing I want to note that's important for small nonprofits is that we don't recommend that small nonprofits attempt Pillar 7, which is external evaluation, until their internal house is really in order in the first 6 pillars. You'll find that working through the pillars becomes more intuitive as you go. For example, elements of culture and shifting culture that we see in Pillar 5 is really a natural outgrowth of working through your leadership challenges and also making sure that your programs and strategies are well designed and well implemented, as highlighted in Pillar 3. For those of you who are already familiar with the performance imperative and really are thinking to yourself, you know, bring it on, what do we do next? We also developed something called the Performance Imperative Organizational Self-Assessment. The short form is PIOSA, and you should all keep looking your inboxes later this year as we actually rebrand this to something a bit more memorable. While the performance imperative outlines organizational pillars and principles that support high performance, the PIOSA presents one or more specific practices or specific behaviors that represent manifestations of each principle in action. So this PIOSA is not a typical self-assessment, and that's by design. The tool is really a vehicle for reflection. It sparks and fosters dialogue, and it drives continuous improvement. It's not the kind of assessment you can fill out quickly and generate a composite score. And it's definitely not a ruler for rapping anyone's knuckles. We had one PIOSA user that recently said, it's a wonderful opportunity to celebrate how far we've come and to make sure we're considering all of the right questions and the next steps to achieve our goals. So let me give you an example. In the PIOSA Pillar 1, which again is on leadership, it offers not only the importance for the board to review on an annual basis the CEO or executive director, but we also suggest the specific points of setting goals, performing a self-assessment, and including insights from staff. Perhaps the best news about both the performance imperative and the PIOSA is that they're free downloads from the LEAP Ambassadors website, and we'll be sharing more about that and other resources as we continue. So why did we tackle this idea of small but mighty? Well, as you can see from this simple pie chart, our motivation was based on the clear majority of nonprofits, as high as 88% of our sector, having less than $3 million in annual revenue. I want to give a huge shout out to my co-lead and author for Small But Mighty, Karen Walker. Karen couldn't be with us today, but as we wrote the paper and prepared this webinar, we really felt an urgency to communicate some viable entry points for leaders of small nonprofit organizations. Karen and I both have extensive experience working with and for small nonprofits, so we wanted to translate our knowledge to make the performance imperative accessible. I also want to take just a quick moment to give a shout out to 10 other LEAP Ambassador colleagues of mine who really helped challenge ideas and pull the paper together as we were thinking about our collective experiences with small nonprofits. I recognize that there are many small nonprofits participating in this webinar who are what we would call very small but mighty. Perhaps you have budgets ranging from $100,000 to $500,000, and you may be wondering if this could work for your organization. In the same vein, there may be funders on the line who want to better understand if the performance imperative can be applied to their small nonprofit grant partners. I encourage you, each of you, to find at least one potential area that resonates for you, one pillar, one change, one action that you can take into your next staff meeting or your next board meeting to get started on your own journey. So the reality of what's going on in our sector right now is really this first bullet point. All of you are being asked to, or you're the one asking, small nonprofits to demonstrate their performance. And in an ideal world, the drive for results, the drive for continuous improvement, and the drive to really get to high performance comes from you. It comes from the nonprofit leaders who are running organizations. Here's the good news. The good news is that smaller organizations actually have certain advantages over their larger colleagues. You will often maintain close connections to the people you serve and to your broader community. Perhaps because of these relationships that you maintain, your staff is deeply committed to their work, often making the organization surprisingly resilient. You have another benefit, which is that tactically, smaller nonprofits can get everyone in one room to learn and come to agreement much more easily than our larger, more bureaucratic organizations can. This allows for more nimble decision-making, especially when there's a guiding framework like the performance imperative. Many small nonprofit leaders, I would argue, are social entrepreneurs. They may have founded their organizations and they run their organization as a mission imperative. It is actually their purpose for living. So we encourage you to think about the performance imperative as your GPS, because who doesn't need a GPS in today's world? So now we want to take a deep dive into one organization and their journey to high performance. We chose to highlight SHALVA because SHALVA is in the midst of an extensive change process in several of the performance imperative pillars. I want to encourage even smaller or less resourced leaders to listen to SHALVA's case study and pull out pieces that could work as starting points on your own journey to high performance. There is no perfect end point, but the journey needs to start somewhere, and that somewhere starts with a committed leader. So a little bit about SHALVA. SHALVA is a small but mighty organization with approximately $1 million in annual revenue. They have 4 full-time and 9 part-time staff and a 23-member board. SHALVA is based in the Chicago area and is the only Jewish licensed domestic violence agency in the state of Illinois. I've had the pleasure of working with them on a journey to high performance for the past 2.5 years of a 3-year process, and our work coincided with their 30th year anniversary. Although we've worked very closely and made great progress, we really want to encourage other small nonprofits to understand the performance imperative and that it truly is possible to take the first step on your own. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Sara Block and Carol Ruderman, both of whom I work with very closely. They both exemplify the courageous and adaptive leadership that the performance imperative emphasizes in Pillar 1. They shared a feeling of urgency and impetus to do something more strategic and more data-informed for SHALVA, which led to our work together. Sara Block has been SHALVA's board president for 3 years, but she's been involved on the board for 11 years. She strategically determined both when would be the best time for her to be president and what she wanted to achieve during her term. Because SHALVA uses succession planning, Sara used her year as president-elect to determine her specific goals as tied to outcome management. In this process, SHALVA extended her term for an extra year to see her vision through to fruition. Carol Ruderman has been SHALVA's executive director for 4 years. Prior to SHALVA, Carol worked in a data-driven organization and knew that SHALVA could do more. She has challenged her staff to embrace change and have a mindset open to the process. I want to warmly welcome Carol and Sara to the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you.
So before we dive into the details of what you've done on your journey to high performance, Sara, I wonder if you could start by describing a little bit about how this even came about.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you. When I began my term as president of the board of directors of SHALVA, the time was right and ripe to think about bringing our organization to the next level. Our executive director had enough time in her position, about a year and a half, to fully know and understand the organization, yet she had not been there so long so as to lose her open-mindedness and thirst for innovation. SHALVA was fiscally healthy, our board was strong and supportive, and the need for our quality services was not waning. Within this context, I set a vision and goals for my presidency. I had a vision of messaging domestic abuse and the work of SHALVA in a more positive and inviting way, in a way that brought the cause dear to people's hearts rather than being at the end of a 30-foot pole. I envisioned that SHALVA could determine what we stand for in a way that is bigger than what we do each day in the office with our clients. SHALVA was in a unique position to consider the impact we were having on our clients and the community, and I set the goal of measuring this success. There are challenges around defining and measuring success for many nonprofits, but for a domestic abuse agency based upon a feminist empowerment model, it is even more challenging because the impact on our clients is more intangible and based upon individual growth sets of measurements. For example, we do not measure success based upon the number of women who divorce or leave their abusive partners, but rather we see success as a woman's individual journey toward healing and whatever that means to her. We quickly realized through conversations with Debra that understanding what SHALVA stands for in a more positive way, our vision, mission, and guiding principles, are inextricably linked to how we define success. So the process of developing both go hand in hand. And actually, our more positive understanding of what SHALVA is became the foundation for our ability to determine what constitutes success for us. And only then could we begin measuring our impact.
Sarah, so Carol speaking. Sara and I were actually, I'd like to add, on the same page. While we deal with a subject that's so negative and heartbreaking, I too felt there was an opportunity to shift our messaging from the negative to the positive. I felt doing that would help us better deliver our mission both internally and externally. And then, of course, there was that huge measurement piece. Sara and I both saw that measurement and messaging were interwoven, and Debra saw that too. So I then felt it was my responsibility to put the pieces together and make it happen. In our case, it was fortuitous that a foundation who had previously helped fund SHALVA's core services invited us to apply for a special capacity building grant to address a specific issue that impacted our organization and the community we serve. We wanted to do a measurement evaluation project. So we interviewed several consultants, chose Debra, and then included her proposal in our request for grant funding. We were thrilled to be awarded a 3-year grant that preserved not only our funding for general operating, but also gave us the funds to embark on our journey to high performance. We were very lucky. The timing was perfect and things just fell into place. Both Sara and I had a lot of nonprofit experience, but we're also both fairly fresh to our roles, and I think this also helped to make this happen.
And I'd also add that the close relationship that I as board president have with Carol as executive director allowed us to approach this process as a top priority for our organization.
Thank you both so much. That's so helpful. It's very clear that your working relationship has been a key factor. So once funding was secured, what was really the plan for the journey to high performance?
So Sara and I were very excited to share the journey with our board and staff. And as I had said, we had outlined our 3-year plan in the grant application, and that 3-year plan is up on your screens right now. But the funding created both the capacity for us to do this and the necessity that we better get started. Still, it was a huge change in thinking for both our board and staff. We tried to stress this was the way of the future, just as Debra mentioned in her introduction. Both current and future funders were all requesting outcomes, not just outputs, and I think this helped to justify the need for both our board and staff. With Debra's help, we were also able to communicate that this would help to improve our work internally and help us better explain to others what we do and the great impact of our work. This project process had great value in and of itself. It could do so much more for our agency other than just fulfill funder requests. Yet there was pushback, and at times there still is. It took a lot of time to gain buy-in and trust from our staff.
And with the board, we talked about the grant we had received and the work it is funding at every board meeting and provided updates. While putting their trust in us, it did take some time for the board to grasp the process and see the forest among the trees.
So the full staff, along with our board leaders, were included at the very beginning with 2 visioning sessions. Staff was then brought into the process at each stage depending on their expertise. Both their buy-in and expertise were critical to the success of this project. We would meet in subgroups and then periodically report on progress at full staff meetings. It took time, but slowly they started to see the value and benefits of what we were doing. They had considerable input into the process. It really was something they all helped to create.
So it sounds from both of you like the reality of the journey is that once you take the lid off of a comfortable process, where an organization may just be chugging along, not at high performance necessarily, but pretty comfortable, that it's a bit of a risk because many good and bad things about an organization may be revealed, and you then have to deal with that. So Carol, can you tell us a little bit more about who specifically has been involved in the process?
Sure. So initially it was our past presidents and the executive board members who came together, were involved in visioning to determine our overarching foundational work, our target population, our mission, our vision, our guiding principles, and our services and structure. For the program-specific work, staff expertise was needed. Clearly, our clinical and outreach teams, but also our administrative team. They often provided the reality check we needed. They knew what was really happening in the office and provided that check on feasibility. Would implementation work, and what did we need to make it work? Each team had an important and, in fact, a very critical voice.
So many of the participants on this webinar may actually be thinking, oh dear, 3 years is a really big commitment. So Sara, can you help folks understand what SHALVA has actually achieved?
Sure, of course. We answered big questions about who we were as an organization, including revamping our mission and our vision, which is on the slide now. We wanted a much more positive and unifying statement of what we strive for and what we hope and what we actually do to move toward that.
And Carol, anything to add there?
Sure. We developed our guiding principles, a common language that guides our work. And this is really a living document that we use in the office.
And I'll add too that we also clarified our target audience and codified our services and structure, and now articulate who we are, who we serve, what we offer, and how everything ties to our mission and ultimately our vision. And this slide paints a picture of what I just described.
And so we now measure our outcomes and just not our outputs, and everyone knows what that means. We started on the left side of the pyramid, counting our efforts as we always had done. But now we are also on the right side. We can actually articulate the results of our participants and clients. We developed standard surveys for clients and participants, and just as important, we established protocols to guide the when and how we distribute, collect, and use them. We know what we are aiming to achieve, and we now have clear results for both our community education program and our clinical work. We have a theory of change for both programs, and most exciting, we're beginning to use our data to inform our programming decisions.
So to summarize a little bit for all of you on the line here, how SHALVA's work ties out to the pillars of high performance specifically, we have really focused most of our efforts in pillar 1, 3, and 6, where pillar 5, in terms of a culture that values learning, has actually been a byproduct of the process at all phases. So let me give you all some specifics. Pillar 1 guided our efforts around leadership communication, clarifying mission, implementing feedback loops with clients and participants, using data to improve, questioning what SHALVA should consider stopping in terms of programming, and communicating their results strategically. Sara and Carol used an early version of the PIOSA, which is, again, the organizational self-assessment, and we discussed the differences in their responses to be able to identify gaps and opportunities for improvement in leadership. We used Pillar 3 as the driver to develop and actively implement SHALVA's theory of change for each program. With the initial year of data, SHALVA has started making program improvements and considerations for certain expansions and services. Issues of how SHALVA treats clients with respect and empathy and develops high-quality standards were baked into their guiding principles, which we then test on a regular basis with staff. Pillar 6 then provided the impetus for data use rather than just data collection. We regularly review the data and are starting to discuss and determine, as Carol mentioned, program changes based on the results. The board is asking important questions, and Sara and Carol are actually encouraging open dialogue for continuous improvement. And finally, in terms of Pillar 5 serving as an overlay, we've carved out time in staff meetings to reflect on our work, to discuss potential shortcomings and concerns, and to continuously encourage curiosity and constructive feedback from staff and board. So back to you, Carol. Nonprofit leaders on this webinar might be wondering, how on earth did you carve out staff time and have the capacity to stick with it for 3 years? What might you advise them?
Well, I must admit, at times it's been really hard, but with Debra's guidance, we had a detailed plan for each year, and she really held us accountable and kept us moving forward. As best we could, the updates and process changes were discussed at regularly scheduled staff or department meetings. The visioning sessions required special half-day sessions, and there was a lot of planning time with Debra, Sara, and me that really no one else saw. But the bulk of the time commitments were well integrated for staff and board. Once our team started gaining trust in Debra and the process, the change management got easier. The staff began to see the value of what we were doing, and it became a priority for them as well. For example, there'd always been resistance and confusion in distributing and collecting client and participant surveys. Now they're both just a regular part of our process, and it is actually saving us time. There was real evolution in staff. Another example, we knew that we wanted the client feedback to go beyond our surveys and wanted client interviews to be part of our process, something SHALVA had never ever done before. With initial and legitimate concerns about both client confidentiality and the potential of re-traumatizing our clients, staff went from a mindset of, you cannot talk to our clients, to actually suggesting that Debra made evening hours to speak with more clients. We had all worked together on a protocol, so it was acceptable to everyone. And then when we started seeing the results, it was pretty exciting. We were also able to devote study time to the process based on both staff longevity and the fact that we had very little staff turnover during this time. We just had a couple new staff hires, and having the process and protocols documented have also made the new staff orientation much better.
And I'll also add that, as I mentioned earlier, the board was involved for periodic updates, and Debra presented to the board for major deliverables. We discussed the process and progress at each board meeting.
So a question for both of you. According to the performance imperative, the definition of high performance is the ability to deliver over a prolonged period of time meaningful, measurable, and financially sustainable results for the people or causes the organization is in existence to serve. How do you think SHALVA's actions lead you to higher performance? And Carol, I'll ask you to start.
Okay, sure. As the project was all about meaningful and measurable results, it from the get-go moved the needle. And reviewing the initial data this year has moved us further along. And once we have our data system in place, I'm confident it will continue to foster performance improvement. We also now have our client voice. We have our survey protocols, common language to help structure our therapeutic discussions. All client data is gathered in one place and with the same timing. In community education, we have one standard survey used consistently, and all of our programs are focused on specific outcomes with targeted audiences in mind. Community education results and goals for specific programs is much clearer. So for example, in our clinical staff supervision sessions, they just naturally started using the language of our theory of change to discuss clients and cases. It helps them see the progress both for individual sessions and eventually over the long term for our clients. The community education team worked together to create a common outline and PowerPoint for presentations. They're now setting targets for our next fiscal year using data from the prior year. And for the most part, board and staff are all using the common language from our mission, vision, and guiding principles. And as I mentioned before, we now have great training tools for new staff and also new board member orientations. Sarah, anything to add?
Yeah, I would like to add about the board perspective. So from the board perspective, we've become more attractive to income sources, both grantors and donors. Our data is already helping us get new grants and renew existing ones. It is easier for us to set goals that are not only realistic, but also show the potential impact of the funds received. Grantors and individual donors have found our entire 2.5-year process very interesting, impressive, and exciting. The slides and graphics that have come out of this process are integrated for our funders, our donors, cultivation, and board orientation for new board members. And as a result, the board has an increased understanding of what SHALVA does and how our services impact our clients. The board is energized and proud that SHALVA has gone to this next level. We are starting to integrate data reports and enhance sharing the voices of our client into our board presentations and meetings.
So I'm feeling empathetic to those of you who are listening to this case study and wondering, wow, am I ready for this? So Sara and Carol, and I'll start with Sara, now that you've gone through this process, how might others know if they're ready?
Great, so I think I may start off with some ideas about what factors might indicate you are not ready. So if you have weak leadership, especially in your executive director role, you probably aren't ready. And if you're financially unstable, you likely may not be ready for this journey just yet. But even if your agency may appear resistant to change, you can still be resistant to change and enter this process. And if you determine that you are ready, develop your goals, and if they are clear, you may be able to dive into one pillar or two on your own. And if you have more to accomplish, I would recommend hiring someone to work with outside of your organization, like a consultant.
And I would just add that if your executive or board leadership is questioning how to improve results and wants a great framework for improvement, the performance imperative is a really good place to start.
Wonderful. So I'll ask you one closing question. If you could reflect back on the 3 years, actually 2.5 so far, what would you share with the small nonprofit leaders who are on this webinar? And Carol, if you could start us.
Sure. Well, I look back and I'm actually surprised how far we have come and really so proud of what we have accomplished. The tools, methodology, common language developed in our first 2 years are now integrated in our work. The results of this process will continue to be a huge part of just the way we operate beyond Debra's engagement with us. I'm confident of that.
And I'd like to share that we've seen and felt a real culture shift in our organization. Measuring our results is invaluable. Recognizing all of the building blocks needed to get there is important. We couldn't have gotten to this point without reworking our vision and our mission. We needed the board to want a strong organization. This process and the pillars that serve as the underpinning have led us to a great place. It has encouraged more questions and curiosity from board members and made them better ambassadors for SHALVA. This is now just part of how we do business.
I feel the board is better able to understand what we do and what we are achieving, and it's always been hard given the confidential nature of our work. Our staff and the community we serve are also better able to see what we are achieving. I feel it's well worth the time, effort, and investment. It's not a quick process, change is slow, but this is really the work I think nonprofits should be doing.
So thank you both so much for sharing your journey to high performance experience. And we're going to move into a quick poll to see what you all think and who's actually ready to get started. So I'm going to ask everyone, once the poll pops up for you, to answer the question, just a quick yes or no. Do you believe you can find a place in the performance imperative to start? What do folks think? Okay, just a couple more seconds. These responses are very encouraging. So it looks like we have about 80 to 81% of you. Thank you so much, who said yes, actually. You think you can find a place to start. About 19% of you are still hesitating, and that's okay. I want to move into some specific tips beyond the work that I've done with SHALVA in the performance imperative to really get the rest of you more confident and on your way. So it shouldn't be surprising that every nonprofit is so different, not only in your mission, but in your capacity, in your readiness, in your willingness to get started. There are multiple entry points that really do vary from organization to organization. So please don't feel like you need to do this in the exact same way that SHALVA did. I'm not even sure that that's possible because every organization has their unique opportunities and challenges. I do want to offer a couple of quick thoughts on this. One is that whether you have $150,000 in annual revenue or $3 million or anywhere in the middle, you really shouldn't tackle all 7 pillars at once. It would become very overwhelming to everyone and really pull away from your direct programming at that point. You really want to find bite-sized ways to begin the journey, and I'm going to give you some specific ideas. Before I do, I want to share some recent thoughts that were shared with the LEAP Ambassadors team by Mario Marino that might help. He stated recently, and I quote, "High performance starts with a mindset. Being good at what you do is an attitude and commitment. Hiring better, managing better, caring more, defining your outcomes clearly, seeking evidence-based practices, listening more closely, leading by example, and doing the right thing are natural acts of high performance that don't need funding." So with that, where can you begin your journey? I'm going to offer a few very specific places. You can start by just discussing the definition of high performance. Bring it to your next staff meeting, bring it to your next board meeting. It's very short. Put it up on a board or on a screen that's projected and ask people what they think of it. Ask people if it resonates. Ask people if they think that your organization is headed toward this definition of high performance. Another opportunity is to take some time as a leadership team, whether it's at the board level or the staff level, to review the performance imperative as a whole. And for those of you who are used to reading big, thick reports, I want to encourage you. The version that we released in April is only 14 pages long. It's written in short sentences and bullet points. And now I'm really trying to sell this as very doable and feasible. So an option would be to review the whole performance imperative and pull out pieces that really resonate with where you're at specifically. The obvious option is to start with pillar 1. So pillar 1 is leadership. As I mentioned before, it's the preeminent pillar. It's really a gateway to the other pillars. So as Sara mentioned in terms of readiness, it probably requires that you have a strong enough executive director in place that's going to be open to a change process and excited even about the concept of continuous improvement. If your leadership is very strong and in place already, you could consider starting with Pillar 3. If you don't have a well-defined theory of change, Pillar 3, both in the performance imperative and the self-assessment, that again are free tools, are very, very helpful places to start and to document that theory of change. And a third option is to use a pillar to address a unique challenge. We highlight some other small case studies in the paper, Small But Mighty. If you're facing a financial crisis of some kind, perhaps one of your main donors has pulled out or is threatening to, perhaps you're at risk of losing government funding, which many of us in the state of Illinois have certainly faced in real time. You may want to look at the financial sustainability pillar as a way to guide your way forward. So with that advice, I'm going to jump into one more poll, which is wondering who's planning to use the performance imperative. So if you could let us know, what's the likelihood that you'll check out the performance imperative for your own nonprofit? Let's see what folks think. Okay, just a few more seconds to vote here on your likelihood. All right, so we're going to close that poll. It looks like a lot of you are highly likely or somewhat likely to dive in. So that is just fantastic. And I want to address not only the great numbers, but those of you who are still hesitant, maybe neutral or somewhat unlikely. I'm going to give you one more idea here for how to make this so tangible and possible. So we encourage you, after we go through the Q&A, or if you are a great multitasker, even during, I want to encourage participants to visit the website at leapambassadors.org. We have a wealth of resources available, and if you only have 4 minutes, right? So you've already dedicated yourselves to over an hour in this webinar. If you only have 4 minutes at a point later in this week, I want to encourage you to click on the performance imperative and go to the video. So you can see it here in the bottom right side of the slide where it says, what's the performance imperative? We've put together a 4-minute video. We've received feedback from a lot of groups in Pittsburgh, in Washington, D.C., in Chicago, and on the West Coast, who say that it really resonates. It resonates to show the video to senior leadership. It resonates to show this video at a board retreat. And we're going into summer, so I know a lot of you have board retreats on the docket. And I want to just encourage you to say that you really have nothing to lose, so much to gain, and that small nonprofits' potential can really only be realized when people set course to high performance. So with that, I'm going to thank everyone for their time, but don't leave us, because I'm going to hand this back to Adrian to guide us through a Q&A session.
Thanks, Debra. And of course, Sara and Carol, I appreciate your time. That was a fantastic presentation. Just a reminder to registrants and attendees, this session is being recorded, and we will send a copy of the recording around within the next 24 to 48 hours. So, I know that question has come in quite a bit during on the question tab. I just wanted to start right there. Secondly, we have a few minutes here to make sure we answer questions. I've got 15 or 20 questions sitting in queue, but please take a moment now to open your question tab and submit questions, and I'll make sure we do our best to get them answered. Any question that doesn't get answered today, we will have it on file and we will get back to you with a response. So first question, Debra, I think it came in and it likely relates to you. Can you distinguish between the engagement with the performance imperative and the process you articulated and strategic planning, maybe small s, small p?
Sure. Thank you so much for that question. It's been really different from strategic planning in a couple of key ways, I would say. Although we did revisit and rework SHALVA's vision, mission, we developed guiding principles, we gained clarity on the target audience and the outcomes. And all of those really are pieces of any solid strategic planning process. SHALVA was coming off another project where they were working with a fundraising consultant, and they really had their financial house in order. So we didn't touch on financial health. And in a traditional strategic planning process, you would most likely have a financial sustainability component as an integral piece of that process. I think the second change, which is a big one, is that knowing we had 3 years drove an intentional process that really connected the dots between strategic vision and outcome management, and it moved us into implementing the theory of change, including tool development. So we spent time on a change management process, and we're now at the point where we're implementing a robust data management system to pull all of the pieces together and allow for real-time reporting and data use. So in strategic planning, you typically have 6 to 9 months, give or take, and it's an opportunity to kind of document where you are, where you're going, and what you're aiming to achieve in a solid way, but it doesn't necessarily, in fact, it almost never includes the time for the critical mindset shifts, for the culture change, or certainly for the implementation of the strategic vision.
Very, very helpful, Debra. Thank you. This question came in from a number of folks who are small but mighty on today's webinar, and they are team members with small nonprofits that are part of a national affiliated group. And so I wonder if you can speak to any experience you have or recommendations if you're a small nonprofit but you have a parent organization that may be part of your governance and leadership. How would you recommend those organizations embark along the performance imperative?
So if it's the small nonprofits that are asking, I think it depends how much oversight the national group has. And I guess conversely, how much autonomy each small nonprofit, whether it's a chapter or their own affiliate structure, has. I think there are certainly parts of the performance imperative that can be tackled at the affiliate level. And then there are, depending on the structure of the national organization, there may be other pieces that need to be kind of sold up the chain to the national organization. So unfortunately, it's kind of one of those that depends. I think that the most important piece is who's interested. I think that I would go back to what I said during the webinar about Pillar 1 and leadership, which is that these types of organizational changes really need to be, to a large extent, top-down. There are parts of the performance imperative that can happen at a staff level, certainly, especially when we're talking about program monitoring, program performance. But when we're talking about leadership in Pillar 1 or management in Pillar 2, I think at that point the right leadership needs to be in place. I just want to see if Carol has anything to add to that, because she worked for a national organization prior to SHALVA.
No, it's a really good question. And again, I think the key probably, as Debra said when she started answering, was how much autonomy there was for the chapter or the region or whatever it was. But I think certainly, as you said, from the programming standpoint, they could do that. I think you can't redo a vision or a mission or any of that, but I think you can make. Well, we did our guiding principles that guided the whole organization. You can do things like office norms or what's right for your chapter again or region. So I think you can pull pieces from it.
Thank you, Carol and Debra. Here's a question that I think probably Carol and Sara can best answer. It comes in a number of different forms, but I'll try to summarize today. Sara, the way you opened up the discussion today, you helped us understand why you felt SHALVA was ready for this, the adoption of, or to go through the performance imperative. In many ways, you as at the board leadership level is a great place for you to start that conversation. However, many folks on today's call are executive directors or CEOs of their small but mighty nonprofits, and they're wondering how they can best introduce this to their board. So the inverse of the process you went through, you recognized that Carol had been with the organization long enough to be still open to innovation, and but understood enough about the organization but remained open to innovation, which was a neat turn of phrase. How would Carol, you or Sara recommend executive staff who may be on today's call opening this and getting board level engagement and enthusiasm around it?
Well, I'll go first on that because there was a little bit of both here. Sara really came to me when we discussed her presidency with turning it around, that more positive outlook. When I came to SHALVA, I think, Debra, it was mentioned, I came from a very data-driven organization. So I shared with Sara that I came to her with that I was really struggling without the data, how to manage what you cannot measure. And so it was almost symbiotic. It really went both ways in our case. But I think, having a good relationship and open discussion and really, it works both ways, I think.
And I think too, if it's really coming directly from the who's realizing that this is necessary, I think it would start by introducing their executive committee or sort of the high level leadership of their board to the performance imperative in the small but mighty document and really reading it through. And then having a meeting with them about why it's important and what the director thinks could be achieved and what she's experiencing right now that is sort of missing without going through this process. And then I think it's sort of up to the executive committee, once hopefully that they see that, especially that the director will make it see that they can tackle it and there's finances to do so and have a plan in place. But then it's up to the executive committee then to just speak to the rest of the board members and really get those board members on board and excited and understanding it. And I would say that for us, our board had excitement before they had understanding. And so I think the understanding piece took longer to get to a place of true understanding what we were doing throughout this process, but there was excitement and trust there. And I think that came through my involvement and my presentations to the board about what we were doing, and then bringing in sort of those integral presentations from Debra when we had deliverables to share. And board really was able to see the benefits throughout that process.
Thank you, that's helpful. Debra, maybe you can answer this question. How are these pillars particularly applicable to small organizations versus being applicable to large organizations? In other words, what's the small but mighty portion that we should be aware of as leaders of small organizations?
So I think there's something in the first 6 pillars that everyone can find themselves and a place to start. And like I said, the performance imperative has sort of, each pillar is laid out and then has a series literally of bullet points for how we would define implementing that pillar. So I would recommend for small nonprofits to actually find one bullet point in one pillar that they think would be helpful. So I can give you one example. For very small nonprofits, there isn't necessarily a distinction between executive leadership and management leadership. So when you look at pillar 1, which is tied to executive leadership, and pillar 2, which is all about management, those start to merge together for smaller nonprofits that don't have, a C-level suite of executives. So I would encourage the leader of the organization, whether it's the executive director, the CEO, the director of programming, whatever their title is, to go through and look at those bullets and find one that resonates. I also think that even the smallest of small nonprofits have boards of directors if they meet that financial threshold. And I think having an initial conversation between whoever the top staff leadership is and the board president or chair of the board to literally go out for lunch and have a conversation about pillar 1 to start to identify where they can strengthen where they currently are is probably a great starting point.
That's really helpful. There are a number of questions that have come in today related to the presence or absence of board leadership, executive leadership, leading from within the organization, et cetera. Sara or Carol, can you speak either from your current experience or your past experience about ways in which you may have seen a board step in more in a more forward-looking way to its leadership responsibility to the organization? In other words, be prepared to engage with this conversation, support this effort, et cetera. A lot of folks who are dialing in or participating in today's webinar are sharing via the Q&A that they're challenged to get their board to lean in, so to speak. And Sara, I don't know how long you've been on the SHALVA board, but maybe you can speak to maybe other board roles you've had where maybe you've seen and overcome those challenges if it didn't exist at SHALVA.
Great. I will take that question. So I've been on the SHALVA board for 11 years, and professionally, I work at a nonprofit too. So I would say that to me, this process is interwoven with the fiduciary responsibilities of board members. Board members are responsible, obviously, for being fiduciaries to the organizations they sit on the boards for. And as times are evolving, the ability to secure and maintain funding is tied to establishing how well your organization is doing and the impact they're trying to have. And so to me, a sell is for a board that may be struggling to see their role, or a director who has to take a more active role, or vice versa, is to really understand that fiduciary responsibility that board members have. It's not just to ask friends for money and fundraise in that way, but this is sort of the new era of, I think, that fiduciary responsibility. And we've seen the evidence of that very quickly, even as we've engaged in this process without outcomes to share yet, that the process itself has value to the outside funding community. And so I really think that that fiduciary responsibility can be a way to sort of very objectively introduce this conversation.
Yeah, no, and I would just add, I mean, I think the selling points are it has value. It has taken us a lot of time to do this. Once everything's in place, it's really a huge time saver. There's value in the work in and of itself. So I think talking about the benefits of this process, to me, would convince both board and staff.
I'll just add one more thing to that. In my experience, oftentimes everything in an organization changes when someone asks a different type of question at a board meeting. So if the impetus for doing this is coming from executive leadership, but they don't feel like the board is really on board, no pun intended, you could have someone on the board insert a question such as, what types of results have we been seeing over the past year? or, you know, different, or you could even, if you didn't want to plug that, the executive director at a board meeting could pose the question, before I do my presentation or after I do my program presentation, I want everyone to write down one question about what they feel curious about. You know, what didn't I answer that you would like to know to be a better board member? So something that encourages curiosity and makes sure that board members know that that's their role is to be asking questions and pushing for better and better answers.
Thank you. That's certainly very helpful. I don't think there's no silver bullet for that challenge. I think many of us struggle with that, but that's helpful guidance. Some questions have come in about many small but mighty organizations have a preponderance of volunteers doing key tasks for the organization. Can either of you or any of you share insights about whether there was whether SHALVA has a significant volunteer resource component and how that was accommodated in this effort, or whether you have recommendations for thinking about how to engage volunteers who aren't, it's not to say they're not fully committed to our mission, but very often they don't have the level of resources, being perhaps not FTEs, they aren't necessarily available to support this effort to the degree that they might want to.
Sure, I can take that. In the case of SHALVA, we don't have a huge volunteer base just because the work we do is so confidential. So we have a couple of volunteers who help us out in the office, and we did not include them actually in the visioning session. We did talk about that originally. We did feel the staff was needed because just they have a complete understanding, and the board as well, of what we do. But in my previous position, we really did have a very strong volunteer community. And I think there's leadership within those volunteer groups as well. And so I think you could try it. They can ask the right questions. And I think you can certainly address some of these pillars, particularly with things like programming or what they're seeing. And the outside voices are important. So it would look a little different, but I think depending on the volunteer base, of course you could do that. And very often in some organizations, really small ones, the volunteers are acting like staff. They just are not getting the paycheck.
And I would just add too that I think it's a rare opportunity for volunteers to have a strategic voice in the organization. Oftentimes they're maybe task-oriented, and so this is really a way of engaging those volunteers, obviously in sort of a more planned way, in a more strategic view of the organization. And I think there'd be met volunteers who would really grab that opportunity and would be a really good fit. So I think it's kind of knowing what your volunteers' interests are and their potential for sharing and involving themselves in this process. But I do think it's an added layer to what they would usually be doing. And I think some could find it extremely interesting, intriguing, and actually make them more engaged.
And I just want to add, depending on what they do when they're not volunteering for your organization, they can add an expertise and a lens that you don't get just from staff, and you get it from your board. But it could be very valuable.
Adrian, this is Debra. I'll just add one other thought on engaging volunteers. I think, I'm not sure we use the word in the performance imperative, maybe we do, but I think transparency in the process is huge. And I know that constituency voice is also huge. So for organizations who are listening to this webinar and thinking, wow, our volunteers are really our boots on the ground, I think it's very important to get their input at the beginning of the process to really understand what they think is working well and what needs work at the organization when an organization is trying to prioritize where to start. So whether that's in the form of a survey or a focus group or interviews with volunteers, I do think it's important for a volunteer-heavy organization to make sure that they're involved at the beginning and starting to identify what the priorities are.
Great, thank you. A few more questions before we conclude. There are a number of questions that have come in. You mentioned, Debra, the difference between the performance imperative and strategic planning, and you focused on both the mindset at the beginning as well as the ability to track the ongoing execution of the performance imperative, which is really critical. Several questions have come in around how an organization moves toward becoming a data-driven agency, and where there is a data team or a data manager that is particularly intrigued by this whole process but may not have the executive leadership that's receptive to his or her efforts to elevate results and tracking and monitoring. Can you speak to any recommendations you might have about becoming more of a data-driven organization, and for an organization that has a data capacity but perhaps that doesn't elevate, they do the data work but aren't necessarily getting the reception at the executive level that they should? What thoughts might you have about how they can gain traction?
So I think my answer for almost everything will start to sound redundant, which is pose a really important question. So I've had a lot of luck with other organizations who have this exact situation where there's a data manager saying, I can't believe we're not doing more of this, or why do they keep making decisions that are just based on intuition and not based on fact or data? And one thing that I think is really important beyond strategy is relationships. So if that data person can go around the office and ask everyone in the office, my job is to provide you with the data that you need to do your job better. What data do you wish you had at your fingertips? That starts to become a very interesting conversation. And then that data person, being a data person, will take all of the answers that they get in those conversations and turn it into something that makes a case to executive leadership. So I think that's maybe a start. If the data person feels like they're churning out data that is moderately useful, but they feel like they could be doing more, but they're not sure what anyone needs, or they're sitting on piles of data that's collected, but no one ever looks at it and uses it. And by the way, this is an incredibly common issue. I think asking people what data would make your job easier if you had it at your fingertips, maybe is a starter question.
And just another spin on this, and maybe not based on the question you actually asked, but really thinking about how to use this data. This is something that we're doing right now at SHALVA, at each level of leadership, both at Carol's level, at committee levels, at department levels, and at our board level, of each entity really thinking about what we want to know from the data. And what the board's going to want to know at board meetings is not necessarily going to be the same thing that Carol's going to look at every week. And so we're gonna learn how to use our data and figure out what we actually need to know and what we want to know from it. And so I think that's not going to be streamlined across every different department, and you want to be able to nuance it so each area, each department, each entity on your board can get the information they need for their job.
And I just want to add what keeps going through my head, because we had to make decisions on what data we were collecting and how we were asking it. And, Debra kept saying, to what end? Things can be interesting, but then what were we going to do with it? So we really did think through what would help us most when we thought about what we were capturing and trying to capture.
Great. I have one final question. Again, anyone who has questions that are not answered today, please understand that we will get back to those responses. We're starting to run out of time. I'll ask this last question and then provide some final concluding remarks. So there are a number of small nonprofits on today's webinar who hear Sara and Carol's reference to a capacity building grant and wonder, do I need a capacity building grant in order to be able to afford someone like Debra, a consultant, to help me do this work? I wonder, Sara and Carol, and certainly you, Debra, too, if you can speak to one, in round numbers, what was the capacity building grant? What did SHALVA feel like it needed to support this effort? And then two, absent that capacity building grant or any capacity building grant, what could SHALVA have done to move through the PI without the expertise of Debra or someone like Debra?
Well, I think that Debra really at the beginning did a great job explaining how, the materials are all free. They're on a website. I think you just take little pieces. You can't our project was really ambitious. We couldn't have done it without Debra. And really these pillars, we didn't even know about them when we were trying to work on our measurement, our evaluation, and build some capacity. So I think it's just smaller chunks. I think you can do it with a consultant. You can't tackle as many pillars as we did or a big project that we did. But I think you can take small bites and do it yourself. I think that's really the beauty of this. So it was certainly, a wonderful opportunity that we were able to do this.
I want to offer an analogy, if I can, Adrian. I see this work as similar to building a website. So even the smallest nonprofit, right? I mean, I ran a very small nonprofit organization for 10 years, and everyone needs a website, right? So you have several options. You can spend $500 and get Weebly or one of the kind of do-it-yourself websites, and you can find a 20-year-old intern who's going to build you a quick and dirty website. Or you can spend somewhere between $5,000 and $50,000 to hire various levels of consultants. Or you can consider it part of your ongoing strategy to success, and you can hire an in-house communications person. And I think that knowing which one you need to do at which time is really part of the challenge that organizations need to figure out for themselves. I do want to say that, on the LEAP Ambassadors website, on our performance in practice page, which gives a lot of examples of, beyond SHALVA, a lot of examples of organizations that have done this. Even moving from sort of an oral tradition, if you will, oral knowledge to paper, and moving from paper processes to Excel, those are all moves in the right direction to making sure that everyone literally and figuratively is on the same page. So, for a very small nonprofit with very limited resources, I would not recommend trying to bite off as much as SHALVA did. I think, like Sara pointed out earlier, the really key capacity is a sense of urgency at the leadership level. And if you don't have the urgency or the willingness or the interest in the leadership, it's just going to be hard. But if you do have that, then the world is your oyster.
Great, thank you. I think that's a wonderful place to start. It brings us right to the bottom of the hour. So we have taken, and it's been our pleasure to spend part of our afternoon with everyone on today's call. Thank you for your time and attention. Sara and Carol and Debra, thank you for your expertise, your story, and for the commitment you've made to your organization and the community you serve. For those who were in attendance on today's webinar, again, just a quick reminder, the webinar has been recorded. A copy of the recording will be distributed within 24 to 48 hours. You can choose to share that with others. Of course, the pictures of the slides, etc., will be embedded in that recording. So if you want to revisit the performance imperative, Mandela, etc., also links that have been referenced today, all of which are free, not just the performance imperative and LEAP ambassadors links, but also the GuideStar links and the GuideStar invitation to claim and update your profile, again, free. I'll conclude with a sentence that many of you have pointed to in today's Q&A anyway, which is, okay, we're committed to this. Now what do we do to get the funding to support it, or demonstrate the capacity of our organization and the high performance of our organization in the funding community? And it's just a reminder that you do not want to be a best kept secret. The work you're doing is worthy of the attention of your funders and your current stakeholders and future donors. Please remember to take advantage of your GuideStar profile as a way to get your message out to a much, much broader portion of the world of prospective donors than you typically can reach with your own media efforts. It's a free resource, and we encourage you to claim and update your profile and provide that information to that donor community. Debra, Carol, Sara, thank you again for your time. Everyone on today's webinar, thank you for your interest. We look forward to seeing you online in future webinars, and certainly follow up with the LEAP Ambassadors team at the website that you see listed on this page. Thanks again.